If you're new to Operation Market Garden, I'm going to recommend you 2 books on the subject that are the bare minimum that you need in order to fully understand the battle and the debates that are still raging about it. The first is Beevor's Arnhem, which I'm reviewing today, and Nielands's Battle for the Rhine. And in fact, by the end of this video, you should have a good idea about this battle. You should know why the Nijmegen part of the battle is the centre of attention. You should know who was at fault and why they're at fault, and why Beevor's book does not get the full 5 stars, when really it should have got them. And this is the reason the video is as long as it is. In order to explain why Beevors messed up, I'm going to have to take you into the heart of the debate. But I promise you, by the end of this video, you will have been clued up about Operation Market Garden, and we'll be arguing in the comment section below like the rest of us. Links, the sources I use here, and extra notes will be pinned in the pinned comment of the comment section below, so make sure you check them out. Alright, let's get into this. Beevor is at his best here. This is a fantastic narrative which draws you into the battle and keeps you gripped. It's much like Beevors Berlin or Stalingrad books. Great storytelling. It talks about the Allied and German perspectives, talks about the planning stage, talks about what happens in all 3 drop zones, Arnhem, Nijmegen and Eindhoven, and talks about 30 Corps, the tanks, driving up to link with them. Beevor challenges some of the old myths about the battle, such as the phrase "a bridge too far," which may not have been said at all. There's great explanation of the pre-battle part, hammering out the personalities and the planning of the operation superbly. He also tells many tales of how the Dutch civilians were caught in the middle of the fighting, with some heroic but also tragic tales mixed in with the narrative. I think it's heartbreaking at times. He spends the end part of the book talking about the consequences of the failure of the operation, which was the hunger winter in the Netherlands and the starvation of Dutch civilians. And I really cannot emphasise enough just how he tells this entire story very well. The narrative is very absorbing. The storytelling alone is what makes this book rise above most of the others, comparable to A Bridge Too Far by Cornelius Ryan, but this is a far more up-to-date version than Ryan's book. Ryan's book came out in the 70s, which is why I'm happy to say that Beevor's book could finally replace Ryan's book. Now, some of you will still think that A Bridge Too Far was probably a better narrative overall, and that's fine, but I would say that you can now skip that book and go straight for Beevor's book if you're new to this topic, because this is the more up-to-date narrative. And because Beevor gives you the German perspective, you also no longer need to read Kershaw's It Never Snows in September. Now, I would still recommend Kershaw's book if you want more detail on the German side, and if you want the operational side of the battle, where the units are on the map and so on. And Kershaw's maps are, in my opinion, better than Beevor's, although Beevor's are good, as you'll see. But in terms of narrative and gaining all of the perspectives, Beevor's book does a good job of the German side, so Kershaw is no longer essential reading, as he once was. Beevor's maps are also very nice. I don't think there's enough of them, but the ones provided are exceptional. Inside the front cover is a lovely strategic map, and the back cover is another great map of the Arnhem area, both of which are in colour. Other maps are scattered throughout the book, and all these maps are fantastic. Again, this isn't an operational account of the battle, so we're not expecting to know where every platoon is, and these maps are fine for that. The book also provides a bibliography, sources, and an index, so full stars for that. The way that my star rating system works is that I give every book 5 stars to begin with, and then deduct stars off the books if they miss stuff out, or get things wrong, or don't provide good maps, or something. And up to this point, Beevor is at full marks. But Beevor has missed an opportunity here. He could have made the one book to rule them all on Operation Market Garden, but he didn't. He's failed big time, which is why I'm going to have to recommend that you read Nielands's book Battle for the Rhine after you read Beevors. And beyond that, if you want even more details on the issues we're about to discuss, pick up the book Lost at Nijmegen by Poulsen. I hope I'm saying his name right. In fact, I'm deducting 2 stars off Beevor, and to explain why, I'm basically going to have to show you why. So it's time to look at the Nijmegen debacle. The Market Garden plan was for 3 airborne divisions to land in 3 sectors. Eindhoven, 30 kilometres or 18 miles behind enemy lines. Nijmegen, roughly 80 kilometres or 50 miles behind the lines. And Arnhem, 96 kilometres or 60 miles behind the lines. Once they're dropped, their goal was to capture all of the bridges along the route. Then 30 Corps, the tanks, would drive up the road and not swing into Germany, as some people say, but actually go north to the Isselmeer. Zuiderzee. Sorry. This would cut off the German 15th Army on the coast, either forcing them to retreat or weaken them enough so that taking the Scheldt estuary would be easier. This would allow supplies to flow into Antwerp, which would then allow the Allied armies to continue their advance into Germany. Go pattern. Please see my main Battlestorm Market Garden documentary for the full explanation of what happens at all parts in the battle, but today we're going to be focused on the 82nd Airborne at Nijmegen, which is where the arguments begin. At 1:30 in the afternoon of the first day of the operation, the first wave of Gavin's 82nd Airborne Division land at Nijmegen, along with Browning's Corps HQ. The 504th Regiment takes the southern bridges with the help of elements of the 508th. Otherwise, the 505th and 508th guard the landing zones at the Groesbeek Heights and explore the Reichswald forest, where it was believed that the Germans were hiding 1,000 tanks. We'll come back to the 1,000 tanks debate later, but the important point is no one goes towards the Nijmegen Road Bridge, which at this point has 19 German guards, half of whom were not SS. The landings had taken place at 1:30 in the afternoon and at 7 in the evening, 5.5 hours later. Gavin finally decides to send a full battalion towards the Nijmegen Bridge. He tells Lindquist to send Warren's 1st Battalion to go to the bridge. Now, some people have complained in previous videos of mine saying that the 82nd Airborne absolutely had to guard their landing zones. Yes, but nobody's saying they should have moved everyone off the landing zones. They just needed to send 1 battalion to go to the bridge, and if they could spare 1 battalion at 7 in the evening, why couldn't they spare it several hours earlier? The answer is, they could. But they didn't, and this is the question that needs to be answered. Why didn't they send it earlier? Anyway, Warren heads off towards Nijmegen at some point between 7 and 8, so 6 or more hours after the landings. 1 company gets lost in Nijmegen, 1 company ends up fighting in the centre alone because the 3rd company doesn't catch up until later. And it's not until nearly 8 hours after the initial landings that they start to grapple with the Germans. It's dark at this point, and they only get to the bridge at around midnight, 10 hours after their initial drop. The problem is, because the bridge was still in German hands, the Germans were able to send in reinforcements. As the paras near the bridge, units from the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions arrive from the north to defend the bridge. Only 2 companies engaged the Germans, who now had more men than Warren had, and worse, Warren was ordered to withdraw his battalion at 11 o'clock that evening in order to help out at the landing zone. The frustrating part is, nothing was attacking the landing zones on day 1. Maybe a few scattered elements, but no more than an understrength company of Germans were in the area. In fact, the only unit in the Reichswald at the time was the HQ unit for the 406th Division. which had only formed into a division overnight. On day 2, the 406th Division had gathered a bunch of units, mainly training and replacement battalions and eyes and ears battalions, and then some Luftwaffe infantry, and formed 4 Kampfgruppen numbering at most 3,400 men. But in reality, less than 3,000 actually attacked, and these had very little infantry support weapons or artillery. The guns they did have were captured Russian guns. They had no signals equipment, so it was hard to coordinate the attacks, didn't have any tanks, only had 5 armoured cars and 3 half-tracks with anti-aircraft guns on them. They were going up against the elite 82nd Airborne, who were on their 3rd campaign and who were defending. To quote the man in charge of the division, "I had no confidence in this attack, since it was almost an impossible task for the 406th Division to attack picked troops with its motley crowd." This attack somehow gained a few local successes, but when the second air landing happened on the second day, the Germans fled the battlefield, losing numerous casualties, having only inflicted light casualties on the Americans. After this attack on the second day, no attack came from the Reichswald on day 3, and the next attack on day 4 was a bigger attack, but now the full 82nd Airborne had arrived and had tank support. 30 Corps arrived at 9:30 in the morning of day 3. This is on time, by the way. They'd gone 50 miles in less than 43 hours and were just 10 miles from Arnhem. Arguably, they could have done it a bit quicker. Arguably, they were a little behind schedule maybe, but they weren't 36 hours behind schedule at this point, as Gavin claimed later. A mistake that has been repeated by many historians and is still being repeated in certain books, including Beevor's book. Anyway, 30 Corps found that the Nijmegen Bridge was being held by the 10th SS Panzer Division. Several tanks brewed up and the British and American infantry fought together trying to break through to the bridge. The point to note, though, is this. On the morning of day 3, 30 Corps had reached Nijmegen. They were just 10 miles from Arnhem, and they had the rest of the day to go to make it to Arnhem on time, which they could have done if the bridge was in their hands. But it wasn't. Gavin's claim that 30 Corps was 36 hours behind schedule was right in one respect. They were 36 hours behind schedule, but not before Nijmegen. They were 36 hours behind schedule because of Nijmegen. Because 30 Corps had to fight for the bridge. It was the beginning of day 3, and the bridge would only be secured overnight on day 4 to 5. 4 tanks do get across the bridge late on day 4, but one of these is knocked out, which Beevor forgets to mention, and they have no supporting infantry. Some say there was more, possibly 5 tanks, but either way, there was just a handful. The reason they don't have any infantry is because the British infantry are fighting in Nijmegen City against 10th SS Panzer Division, who refused to give in until the morning of day 5. Arguably, they should have had some infantry and a tank force ready to head north, and that's fine, but the point is this. They were already delayed by 36 hours at this point. The main issue is why Nijmegen Bridge wasn't taken on day 1. By the time 30 Corps gets going on day 5, Arnhem Bridge is in German hands and the operation is lost. If they had driven straight across the bridge on day 3, even if they had to fight north of Nijmegen, they would have had an easier time of it because they wouldn't have been fighting in a city. People make the claim that there still would have been a hard fight north of Nijmegen, and I agree. But it's better for tanks to fight in open terrain than against infantry in urban terrain. This is why Frost held on so well at Arnhem, why Chuikov held on so well at Stalingrad, and there's numerous more examples of this. It would have been better for 30 Corps to fight north of Nijmegen than inside it. And it stands to reason that if this fight had taken place to the north, they would have reached Frost at Arnhem Bridge on day 3 or day 4 before his units collapsed. Therefore, failing to take the Nijmegen Bridge on day 1 of the operation cost the operation. So that's the context, but how does Beevor's book fit into this, and how come he gets 2 stars deducted? Well, first, Beevor blames Montgomery, Browning and Horrocks. And it's not so much about who he blames, you can blame whoever you like. Urquhart's the wrong guy for the job, apart from Frost and the elements that make it to Arnhem Bridge. The Arnhem operation is a complete disaster. Browning is an idiot, and his blaming of the Polish general Sosabowski was a disgrace. Montgomery is a selfish, egotistical liar who could have done things differently in this operation. I don't think Montgomery is as bad as some people make him out to be in this operation, but he certainly could have done a better job of the plan. And there's other British generals who are to blame as well. The issue isn't so much who Beevor blames, as to his reasons for blaming them, and the arguments he uses to blame them are flawed. He's correct with Montgomery, and he might be right with Browning, sort of. But he's not right with Horrocks, and there's a lot more to the Browning story than Beevor states. So let's look at all of this and see why some of Beevor's arguments just don't hold up. Throughout the book, Beevor attacks Horrocks for being too slow. Well, this is a questionable claim at best. After the war, General Gavin said that Horrocks was 36 hours behind schedule when he got to Nijmegen. But is this really the case? 30 Corps only starts driving along the road at 2 in the afternoon of day 1, so it's not a full day. Ideally, by the end of the day, Horrocks should have linked up with the 101st Airborne, and he was a couple of hours off from doing that. So yeah, I guess he was an hour or 2 behind at this point. He then gets to Son Bridge on day 2 to find the bridge was blown, and he takes 8 hours to fix it. It's not until the morning of day 3 that 30 Corps moves beyond this point. So in the early hours of day 3, they're behind. But look how much ground they cover. They get to Grave at 9:30 in the morning on day 3. They've not even been on the road 48 hours yet. They have the rest of the day to go, and they're now at Nijmegen. They've gone around 50 miles in 2 days, despite all the opposition and Son Bridge being blown. They only have about 10 miles or so to go before they reach Arnhem, and still have the rest of the day to do it. So yeah, they get to Nijmegen on time. And I don't know about you, but being on time does not equal slow. They then face the 10th SS Panzer Division, and it is here that they suffer the 36-hour delay that Gavin said about. Yeah, okay, they may have been an hour or 2 behind schedule, arguably, but they weren't 36 hours behind, not at this point. This is where the 36-hour delay comes from, Nijmegen. So, Horrocks and 30 Corps weren't slow, but Beevor constantly, over and over, hammers on about the British drinking tea and how Horrocks wasn't on his game, and how they were 24 hours behind schedule on day 2 when they weren't. The tea drinking is more frustrating because these guys are apparently not allowed to take tea breaks. They have to drive to Arnhem in 3 days without stopping for food or drink. And also, just because one tank takes a break doesn't mean the rest all take a break as well. So it's a ridiculous claim. Then, after all this talk about tea drinking and slowness, on page 220, Beevor finally admits that the failure to capture Nijmegen Bridge on day 1 was the main reason for the failure. So after blaming Horrocks over and over throughout the book, Beevor finally admits Horrocks wasn't to blame. And then he still has to say that 30 Corps was late. The simple truth is that 30 Corps was too late, and so was the capture of the Nijmegen Bridge as a result of defending the Groesbeek Heights. stop saying 30 Corps was late. 30 Corps was not late. It's a myth. Now, there is an issue about the handful of British tanks that get across the Nijmegen Bridge on day 4. And this bit is a debate, and I'm going to try and explain it as best as I can, but if you want more information, please read Nielands's Battle for the Rhine, which is why I'm recommending that you pick up both Beevor's book and Nielands's as well. But basically, a few British tanks make it across the bridge late on day 4. Now, at this point, 3rd Battalion of the 82nd Airborne had crossed the Val in boats, as well as other units, and a few of these paras had made it to the northern side of the Nijmegen Bridge. Not all of them, since a lot had to guard the crossing site and engage the Germans elsewhere. But some had made it to the Nijmegen Road Bridge at the north. I want to make this clear absolutely now. It was claimed after the war that the US powers were willing to go with the tanks to Arnhem. As Beevor points out, and to his credit he disputes it, there's even a story about one of the US powers threatening the British tank officer, and there's several other stories that are similar to this. The problem is, these claims were made after the war, and they don't take into account what the British tank men said themselves, nor do they take into account the 3 very obvious reasons as to why the British shouldn't go on to Arnhem. British Sergeant Robinson's account of what happened shows that the US paras were completely exhausted by their crossing of the Val, and in fact said that the paras hadn't been there for 10 minutes before they were on their way again. Another, Lord Carrington, the guy the US paras claimed they had an argument with after the war, tells this account. Mine was the 5th tank across the bridge, and there were still Germans in the superstructure. When I got across, there was no sign of Sergeant Robinson, or indeed anyone else, so I halted my tank at the north end of the bridge and wirelessed back that the bridge was open. I was there for a short while, about 10 minutes, and then more tanks started coming across, and I went forward to find Sergeant Robinson. He was stopped about a mile up the road talking to some US paratroopers who were very pleased to see us. When asked about the US officer who would later call the tankers cowards and show how he felt betrayed by the British, Lord Carrington said, "My recollection of this meeting is different. I certainly met an American officer, but he was perfectly affable and agreeable. As I said, the airborne were all very glad to see us and to get some support. No one suggested that we should press on to Arnhem." This whole allegation is bizarre. Just to begin with, I was a captain and second in command of my squadron, so I was in no position either to take orders from another captain or depart from my own orders, which were to take my tanks across the bridge, join up with the US airborne and form a bridgehead. This story is simply lunacy, and this alleged exchange did not take place. Gavin's own memoirs also confirm that the US powers were happy to meet the British tanks, so at best this is a he said, she said debate. But either way, a few tanks and a handful of exhausted US paratroopers couldn't have gotten to Arnhem. And there are 3 reasons for this. First, they expected a German counterattack against the northern end of the bridge. If this had happened, a few tanks and a handful of US paras would have had a hard time defending, let alone attacking. Second, Nijmegen City was still in German hands. This meant that the British infantry and tanks were embroiled in a city fight and couldn't just disengage, nor could they just leave a substantial portion of the 10th SS Panzer Division on their flank, so they had to secure Nijmegen first. And finally, there was German resistance to the north. Now, this may not have been enough to stop an entire division at this point, but it would have been enough to stop a handful of paras and a few tanks. Another member of the Welsh Guards, Andrew Gibson Watt, commented, "An advance that night was not on, and general military historians have erred greatly in assuming that it would have been possible, and should have been done." And all of this is just to show that 30 Corps wasn't slow, or didn't have the attacking spirit. And it is a distraction to the main debate, and this main debate renders the tanks should have pressed on debate mute. If Nijmegen Bridge had been taken on day 1, then British tanks and infantry would have been across the Nijmegen Road Bridge 36 hours earlier and would have been united rather than fighting in Nijmegen to mop up the Germans. So this claim that 30 Corps was slow or that Horrocks was not on his game is complete rubbish, and Beevor fails to put forth anywhere near a convincing argument. His claims that 30 Corps were behind schedule are simply false, and again, a distraction from the main debate. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't the 82nd Airborne capture the Nijmegen Bridge on day 1? Well, the reason given is that the Groesbeek Heights had to be held because there was an intelligence report that suggested 1,000 German tanks were in the Reichswald. On top of this, people point out that the 82nd Airborne Division had to defend its landing zones, which were on the Groesbeek Heights. Okay, well, first off, yeah, the landing zones had to be defended, and they were defended. Nobody's saying you have to pack up and leave the heights undefended. The issue is that Warren's battalion, just one battalion from the 1.5 regiments on the heights, was spared several hours later. So why couldn't it be spared earlier? The answer is it could have been spared, and Warren could have got to Nijmegen 6 hours earlier, well before 10th SS Panzer Division had arrived, and then securing the bridge and then dug in. Just like Frost at Arnhem, they could have held onto the Nijmegen Bridge, meaning 30 Corps would have been across on day 3. Now, people say, yes, but there could have actually been attacks from the Reichswald. True, but in reality, there wasn't. And the irony is, the main threat to the 82nd Airborne Division did not come from the Reichswald. It came from the north of Nijmegen. So, if you're that concerned about defending yourself, taking Nijmegen and her 2 bridges would be the priority. But it wasn't. And where did this idea that the 1,000 tanks come from in the Reichswald anyway? Well, I'm going to be relying on Lost at Nijmegen by Poulsen here, so if you want more details, pick up his book and examine it. But the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment states in its after-action report that 1st Battalion went around questioning the civilians about the Germans in the Reichswald, and they were informed that the 1,000 tanks were not in the forest. In fact, they discovered that the forest was too thick for tanks, and in fact, there wasn't a single tank in there. Now, I don't know where this rumour of the 1,000 tanks started from. People have asked me, but I don't actually know. All I know is that there was a genuine concern that 1,000 tanks were in the Reichswald. That much we can confirm. What I can tell you is that there were currently less than 100 German tanks in the whole of the Netherlands at the time, possibly as few as 50. Yes, technically the Reichswald is actually in Germany, but thinking rationally, why would there have been 1,000 tanks in a random forest 50 miles behind the lines in 1944? It's probably like a third of the German tank strength at this point in the war, and why would the Germans have 1,000 tanks just sat there doing nothing? Well, the simple answer is, well, they weren't. All I can tell you is that on day 1 of the Operation Market Garden, the 505th Regiment of the 82nd Airborne was investigating Dutch civilians trying to figure out if these panzers existed. Frost himself says that the 1,000 tank idea was there by rumour only and not confirmed by the Dutch underground. So why the 82nd Airborne really did think this was a possibility, I don't know. And interestingly, it is at 7:30 in the evening that they confirm that the woods are too thick to house tanks. What time did Warren start heading towards Nijmegen? Between 7 and 8. This is a coincidence. Gavin later claimed that he gave pre-drop orders to Lindquist for him to send Warren's battalion to the bridge. Again, check out Poulsen's book for more details. On the 25th of July 1945, in an official statement to the historical officer Captain John Westover of the US Army Center of Military History, Gavin said, about 48 hours prior to takeoff, when the entire plan appeared to be shaping up well, I personally directed Colonel Lindquist, commanding the 508th Parachute Infantry, to commit his 1st Battalion against the Nijmegen Bridge without delay after landing, but to keep a very close watch on it in the event he needed it to protect himself from the Reichswald. I don't get why he's so concerned about the Reichswald, and so he was planning to pull himself away from the main bridge to go to the Reichswald. I don't get it. I just don't get it. Just before takeoff, I discussed the situation with Colonel Lindquist and directed him to commit not more than 1 battalion to the seizure of the Nijmegen bridges as soon as possible after landing, so as to take advantage of both surprise and darkness. Please bear in mind that it is light, since this is a day operation, and Gavin seems to forget that it's not usually dark in the middle of the day. And as Poulsen concludes, by writing as soon as possible, General Gavin created the illusion that it had been the responsibility of the cautious Colonel Lindquist to decide when to send troops to the Flawed Bridge. By doing so, General Gavin introduced the myth of the misunderstanding and an excuse for not having captured the Flawed Bridge in time for Operation Market Garden to succeed. The misunderstanding argument has been used over and over again and successfully downplayed the role of the 82nd Airborne in Operation Market Garden. So Gavin blames Lindquist and also Warren, saying he was a cautious commander, and Beevor backs him up without really explaining why. But if Lindquist had disobeyed his orders, wouldn't he have been punished for this? Well, apparently not. That to me suggests that this entire pre-drop orders idea is a cover-up for the fact that nobody went towards the Nijmegen Bridge for several hours. Lindquist himself says he never received the pre-drop orders, so again this is a he said, she said debate at best. But what we do have is a convergence of evidence that says Gavin and the 82nd Airborne, possibly Browning as well, were concerned about the threat of 1,000 tanks in the Reichswald at the same time that it was confirmed that this ridiculous claim was false. Gavin then sent Warren's battalion to go towards the Nijmegen Bridge, and this was several hours after they'd landed. Warren then didn't get to the bridge in time before the SS arrived, thus causing the operation to fail. The fault then clearly lies with Gavin and/or Browning. The question now remains, which of these two is actually to blame? Alright, now it's time to look at the main debate and explain why Beevor's book misses the mark. All you get throughout this entire book is praise after praise of General Gavin. Anytime Gavin is mentioned, it's never his fault. It's Browning's fault, it's Warren's fault, it's someone else's fault. Whenever you hear about the Groesbeek Heights being prioritised over the Nijmegen Bridge, the reason given is because Browning wanted it that way. So for example, yet Gavin himself had been told by Browning that his first priority was to secure the Groesbeek Heights southeast of Nijmegen. There's numerous other quotes just like this, with another on page 64 where Beevor says Gavin never challenged Browning about the heights. Well, of course he won't challenge him about the heights. The evidence says it was Gavin's idea in the first place. If you believe Beevor, Browning deprioritised Nijmegen Bridge, and Gavin followed him. But here's a quote from Gavin himself which says otherwise. This decision was made by myself and approved by my corps commander. Gavin made the initial decision, and Browning agreed with it. That's the total opposite of what Beevor says, and this is where I find the most fault with this book. Beevor makes a statement. He says Browning made the initial decision and Gavin backed him up. But he doesn't provide any evidence or even an argument to back up his claim. Nor does he acknowledge that this is up for debate. He just states Browning made the initial decision and paints him as the villain. And the thing is, you can paint Browning as the villain. I said so in my Bad Boy of Market Garden video, but in order to make a proper argument for that, with all the counter evidence we've just been through, you have to acknowledge Gavin's role at Nijmegen. All you have to say is, Gavin made the decision, but this was backed up by Browning, therefore it's Browning's fault. Now, personally, I would still argue against that, but at least it's a valid argument. And if Beevor had done this video would have been about 5 minutes long, and I would have given him 5 stars. But Beevor doesn't say this, and in fact defends Gavin by saying he didn't agree with Browning's decision. But we have evidence that says Gavin did agree with Browning. And we have evidence that says Gavin made the initial decision. So, how do we explain this? What evidence is there that supports what Beevor says? Well, this is the main issue with this book, that there isn't any. Beevor has failed to provide any evidence, and as far as I can see, none exists in any of the other literature. Now, Beevor may have some evidence to back up his claim, which is great, but where is it? What good is evidence if you don't give it us? Alright, let me use an analogy. We all know that 2 + 2 = 4. So what we have here is a valid argument with evidence. The evidence says 2 + 2, and the convergence of that evidence is 4. So our argument is based on the evidence, and thus is a valid argument. Beevor has stated 5. But that's it. He's not said why. He's not provided us with his equation. The current equation says 2 + 2 = 4, and this makes sense. So if Beevor was to claim 5, which he does, this equation must be wrong somehow. Maybe the current evidence has been reinterpreted, and so it's 3 + 2 = 5, or 2 + 3 = 5, or perhaps there's other evidence we didn't know of yet, so it's 2 + 2 = no, 2 + 2 + 1 = 5, yeah. Any of that would make sense. But because Beevor hasn't provided his equation, he hasn't shown us his working out, we can't explain it. And this is where I'm saying Beevor is wrong. He's either wrong with his conclusion, so Browning made the initial decision and Gavin agreed, or that it isn't 5, it is in fact 4. Or that he hasn't provided the evidence that proves that this conclusion has changed. So it wasn't Browning's initial decision somehow, and that Gavin's later claim is somehow rendered invalid. So 2 + 2 = 5, or something similar. Either way, Beevor is at fault here, and I'm left in a position where I cannot explain any of this. Like, given the current evidence, I can't even imagine what sort of evidence Beevor has that invalidates Gavin's statement, where he clearly says that he made the initial decision and Browning backed him up. If he had said Browning agreed with Gavin's decision, therefore it's Browning's fault, I can explain that. If he had said Browning takes overall responsibility for the airborne part of the plan, I can explain that, although I would say Brereton was in there as well. If he had given us some evidence that showed his claim to be correct, I could have explained the argument at the very least, even if I disagree with it. But as it is, I have nothing. I can't explain Beevor's reasoning. It doesn't make any sense. I've been racking my brain over this, trying to think, well, maybe I've forgotten something, maybe there's something else. But I'm in the dark. I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing. I cannot explain why Beevor is arguing what he's arguing. And as I say, evidence might exist, but I can't even imagine. Like, even if Browning had a statement which said, I made the initial decision, then what the heck happened with Gavin? Like, why would he self-inflict his own... You know, Gavin should have just gone, yep, it was Browning's fault. But he didn't. He said, no, I made the decision. So why would he shoot himself in the foot? It doesn't make any sense. So I literally have nothing. I have no idea what evidence Beevor is using. Like, I can't even imagine any that would invalidate Gavin's claim. And even if that evidence did exist, there is another problem as well, because Beevor says Browning made the initial decision and Gavin didn't dare challenge him. But then later goes on to criticise other British generals like Browning for not having challenged his superiors, but doesn't do the same with Gavin. So it's really bad, because if Browning had made the initial decision, why didn't Gavin challenge him? So even if this is correct, and this completely turns out to be correct, Gavin's still in the wrong. So it just doesn't make any sense. There's no point going down this road unless you provide your evidence. There's no point doing this, because you're going to get... I don't even know. I'm just speculating now. I have no idea. I have zero idea what Beevor's on about. The evidence converges on the fact that either Gavin and Browning are at fault, but to make it Browning's fault, you have to admit that Gavin made the initial decision, and that's fine. But that's the problem. Beevor's disagreeing with the evidence. I don't get it. I am lost. I am completely stuffed. I can't explain it. In every battle I've ever studied, there's always been like a sort of, you can see where there's a dispute or whatever. This is a complete opposite. It's like, no, you're not used the evidence. You have, and the thing is, Beevor uses Neelands. It's in his bibliography. He has used it. So if he's used it, why hasn't he figured it out? And I admit he hasn't used Poulsen. He hasn't used Lost at Nijmegen, which is perhaps where he's going wrong. And that's a bad thing. But it's like, you've read Neelands. Are you just ignoring that? I just don't get it. I have no idea. I literally have no idea what Beevor's doing. I can't explain it. I cannot explain Beevor's argument, other than to say the evidence does not support it. So I'm left with this conclusion. Whether the evidence exists to back up Beevor's statement or not, Beevor has failed to provide that evidence in his book. Therefore, his statement falls flat on its face. Given the current evidence, it just doesn't make any sense. We can speculate that evidence might be there, and if that evidence exists, I would still love to see it first, because I think it would be a debatable evidence. But let's suppose it does exist and it does invalidate all the other evidence. That's fine, but until that evidence is presented, and until we know what that evidence is and whether it holds water or not, we are left with the conclusion that Beevor has failed at this juncture. He has failed to provide the answer that we're looking for. Who was to blame for the failure of Operation Market Garden? If I say it's Gavin, nothing in Beevor's book contradicts that claim. His current answer, with the evidence provided, does not work. And it comes across as though he's trying to do anything he can to make sure Gavin is not at fault. The evidence suggests that Gavin is involved in this debate, whether Beevor likes it or not, and Beevor hasn't shown us why Gavin wasn't in the thick of it. But he's happy to praise him over and over and states the opposite of what the current evidence suggests, that Gavin made the initial decision, and I don't know why Beevor did this. So if you guys have any theories on any of this, please let me know, because I'm at a loss. And as a result of all of this, I'm taking 2 stars off the book. 1 for stating something that's contradicted by the current evidence, and the other star for failing to provide evidence to back up the argument, thus leading the reader to the wrong conclusions given the current evidence. Now, the evidence of the current historiography, I can't even say it, historiography contradicts Beevor's claims entirely. Therefore, while I do recommend this book, it is still the most up-to-date narrative of this operation, in my opinion. I can only recommend you this if you read Nijlens's book as well, or watch my videos which explain all of this, and this one has as well. And once you've read Nijlens's book, check out Lost at Nijmegen by Poulsen as well, because that's where a lot of the quotes and the evidence came from in this video, even though it's not really a narrative, it's more of a operational day one affair, but it is still a very good book. So yeah, I think Beevors really messed up here, and he's robbed us of a great, all-encompassing, the one book to rule them all on market garden. And he's given us an example of what not to do. Don't state something without providing evidence for it. I've had plenty of people in the comments of previous videos say that I'm wrong, but then didn't say why or provide any evidence to back up their claims. And any evidence they did do, it was kind of like, yeah, but you've not listened to what I've said, and you've said what I already know. It doesn't make any sense. Again, this is not how you make an argument. 2 + 2 = 4. You've got to state multiple pieces of evidence to back up your claim. And it's a damn shame Beevor didn't do this, and it leaves us speculating why. Why did he not? What is the evidence he was going to provide but didn't? Why didn't he provide it? And what were his reasons for not providing a solid argument? That's up to you to decide, I guess. Anyway, thank you for watching. Thank you to my patrons for supporting. You guys, as always, are awesome. Bye for now.